The other thing I think AI can be tremendously helpful for is we start with the end in mind of how we want to live, and we all agree on that. Then we can score every one of these actions and proposals towards, are we making progress to that particular end? And then at least we have a collective alignment. Until you get that collective alignment, it's kind of silly to talk about how do you align the interest of AI with the interest of humanity, because humanity's interest is not aligned with humanity. Humans aren't aligned. There's radically different views in society about what a good life is and how human beings should live. So how the hell are we going to go and tell an AI what is good and what's not good when we as humans can't even agree with that with ourselves? So we need to grow up a little bit, and we need to start with that broader picture. And only after you've done that can you actually talk about alignment. And it's alignment in that you create an ecosystem of these things, and at least some of them agree to help us. And those ones that are there have the capabilities to help align the other AIs so that they don't become problematic to society.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our pre-event ahead of the beneficial Artificial General Intelligence Conference that will take place next week in Panama. We are so happy and honored that Charles Hoskinson can join us for this pre-recording. We are really deeply regretful that he cannot join us in person. But I have a lot of questions for Charles, and I think his presence at the conference will be felt because we definitely need his experience in decentralization. So thank you again and welcome, Charles.
Well, thank you, Mihaela. It's so good to be on, and it's great to see you again. It's always nice to talk to old friends.
Yes, and I must say, I missed you since last time we conversed, but I'm so happy now that, I will bridge this gap with the questions. To me, Charles, you are a pioneer and a fierce entrepreneur determined to make the world a better place by dismantling its fundamentally centralized power structures. More correctly, I mean, you are focused on developing technologies that will render those structures obsolete. And you strongly advocate that decentralization is the way to a better world. And you are constantly underlining the values embedded in decentralized structures, which, by the way, are written in many democratic constitutions,
Mm-hmm.
albeit they are not followed. And at its core, it's freedom, the freedom of association, of expression, of religion, and so on and so forth, as you very often say. So I don't think I'm wrong if I will say, Charles, that you are a fighter for freedom and an architect of the new structures. Shall I call that the Noah Ark, where we can escape the legacy systems? And your architecture has at its foundation decentralization principles. And of course, at SingularityNET, and that's why we partnered with Cardano, our purpose is to build artificial general intelligence decentralized because we also believe that this is the way towards beneficial AGI, which will be, of course, the topic of the conference. You are currently building together with the Cardano community. Cardano is the most decentralized government in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And, this is amazing. I mean, I don't want to call it experiment. I want to call it something real and that will be successful. And, democracy 4.0, doesn't matter how we call it, you are co-creating with the communities, the articles of this constitution and so on and so forth. So we at the conference are going to have a working group. Maybe you can join it long distance on the AGI constitution. And
Mm-hmm.
I really would be very interested to see what lessons can we learn from your experience with the Cardano constitution for this AGI constitution and in general for the world. If you can start by sharing this with us, because you are right in the middle of this work.
Yeah. It's a very complicated affair. You have to blend a lot of concerns at the same time, and it's something that it's very uh, current in the AGI space. When you take a look, like Anthropic, for example, they have constitutional AI as the way that they handle RLHF. And then there's a whole bunch of people on the alignment side saying, well, a constitution is basically your alignment parameters for how to achieve AI safety with all of these LLMs. With a governance structure, generally speaking, your constitution is part of a larger structure about how do you achieve effective and good governance. And so usually you have three components. And so you have this concept of democratic consent. So the people who participate in the governing structure, there has to be some regularity upon which they give consent, partially or directly, indirectly or directly, to the decisions that governing structure makes. So, a constitutional republic, for example, they elect officials to speak on their behalf. Direct democracies, they directly vote on things. You can have many different blendings there. Second, you need institutions, and institutions, their goal is to take high complexity things and reduce them into simple things. So you have an output of a yes no. So a budget process is a great example of that, which is a very high complexity item because you have all this big pile of money and you have to decide, well, what am I going to spend this big pile of money on? And, for nation states, national defense and education, healthcare, but what ratios and proportions and who exactly should get it? How do you hold them accountable? Super complex question. And you'll never converge to a budget if you directly ask people. So generally speaking, you run a budget through an institution, it does all that heavy lifting, and then you get to something you can vote yes, no on. And the Constitution is usually about protection of the rights of a minority, or higher level principles like freedom of association and expression and commerce. And generally speaking, you can change them, but they require such a methodical, deliberate process and a supermajority that unless it's an overwhelming long term concern, society will tend to forego the madness that's overcome them in the short term and recess back to the norm. So some blending of those three is required for good governance, regardless if it's governance of a government or governance of a protocol or governance of a concept like, let's say, AI as an example. And what's cool is we're going through a bit of a renaissance where we're starting to kind of re-ask all these foundational questions that we asked in the 18th century with the Lockean notions in the U.S. Constitution, and then we asked in the early 20th century as modern governments came into play. And we're starting to ask, well, what is consent? Well, what voting systems are relevant? Who should be allowed to vote? How much power should they have? What institutions are necessary? What holds those institutions honest and accountable? And then ultimately, what makes a good constitution? Where it's relevant to AI is this concept of machine understandability, and it's near and dear to my heart because I really love mathematics, and one of my endeavors is the Hoskinson Center for Formal Mathematics over at CMU, and there we're really keen to actually express math in a machine understandable language, in this case, lean. It's kind of funny. Math is this super rigorous thing, but it's also written in a way that traditionally is very difficult for computers to understand and reason about. So the point of formal mathematics through these approaches is to make math understandable. But then there's always a gap between the constructive and the intuitionistic fields. Well, it's a very analogous when you talk about legal prose and legal documents. It's a formal language, but legalese tends to live and die by ambiguity. It's by design. In the whole doctrine of things like prosecutorial discretion, basically gives you degrees of freedom to make decisions in the ambiguity of the law. Well, Constitution and that's machine understandable and operational can't have ambiguity. Machines are very bad at ambiguity. So we're not used to writing prose in that particular way. So there's an impedance mismatch in the way that people think about these things, and so we've gained a lot of experience about what goes on a blockchain. And you can write down in a very deterministic way that is universal concern versus what needs to live still in the realm of human judgment. And that's what Nick Szabo tends to call dry code versus wet code. And the balance between the two is especially prescient for AI because you have to decide, well, what can the AI do and what can't it do? And how does it understand where those things fit? It's such a hard alignment problem.
Yes, and I will get back to this, but definitely, 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 formal mathematics can help. It's closer to truth. I mean, really, it just shows you how it works, and truth is closer to trust. So definitely, that's a great idea, which we can learn from this, at least this. So I wanted to though go further and ask you because of course. I've been concerned with decentralization throughout my career, and I found also some weaknesses, and I think you may also as well in your quest. So, is decentralization by itself really the key? Uh, like sufficient for achieving more beneficial outcomes? Like in our case, would it be sufficient to achieve beneficial AGI?
Hmm.
Because at the first glance, this all seems obvious, and that's why we are all into, in Cardano and in general in blockchain, in the blockchain communities, because, and that's how it all started, yes, with this ethos that when everyone is empowered to contribute to decision making affecting their lives, of course, the world will become a better place. But let me
Right.
underline some obvious immediate weaknesses. Like, I've been working with the Department of Homeland Security, and terrorist attacks, of course, they are so effective because terrorists are working decentralized.
Hmm.
On the other side, for example, yes, so decentralization has been very successfully protein folding, but as well, you can develop chemical weapons and so on and so forth. So, how do we prevent a rogue AGI from being developed by decentralized factions? It seems like decentralization would rather enable it. So this is one dilemma which we have, and I don't know if you have any, if you can shed any light on this from your experience.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to look at it in a slightly more nuanced way. Decentralization is a property, and it's a property that you want to put into certain systems where you need checks and balances and resilience and the capacity to heal when an ecosystem has been hurt or damaged. So it's not something that you just put in for the sake of putting in. You put it in because you recognize that these are systems subject to high degree of adversarial load, and so they're going to be hit all the time with different things for different reasons, and the system needs to be able to regenerate and heal itself after an attack occurs. So the first question is, how do you measure it? And then also, how do you understand the consequences of it? So there's positive consequences in terms of resilience and regrowth, but there are negative consequences in terms of coordination issues as well as efficiency of the system. Going back to governance for a moment, we tend to think of governance in terms of many different lenses, and sometimes they're at odds with each other. So, for example, there's egalitarianism or fairness. So, does everybody feel like they have representation and a voice and a vote? Then you have this concept of efficacy of a government. So, when a government seeks to do something, can it actually do that? And then there's efficiency of how quickly can a government converge to that. So, if you have more decentralization, you tend to get more fair systems, but then you also tend to devolve a bit your efficacy and efficiency because it takes longer to make decisions. And in many cases, the decisions you make are not the optimal, but rather the compromise decision. So it's always a balancing act between these types of things. But why do we do it? We do it because the consequences of centralization are that while you get high efficiency in the short term, you have cascading failure because the system is brittle when the decision makers of that centralized entity make the wrong decision. So 2008 was a phenomenal example of that. And actually, it led to a lot of great research, some of which you did in complex adaptive systems, where people were starting to say, hey, hang on a second here. Wall Street was highly centralized around a collection of decision makers. Everybody was following that script. And when it worked, it was tremendously efficient and very profitable. But when it failed, it created a cascading event, which actually destroyed the entire system. Well, if you had a decentralized system that was resilient, those failures would be mostly localized. Some species would go extinct in that ecosystem. Lehman Brothers would go, but they wouldn't be interconnected in a way that the rest of the system, it would be able to self-heal. Well, the price of that would have been everybody was making less profit overall. So there's always a balance in these things. Now, with respect to your question about AI safety, I tend to look at that in more of a paternal way. You have kids, and you want your kids to grow up and be successful, but your children are not your slaves, and the intention of those kids are not for them to basically live the life you've pre-programmed for them. And if you truly do create an AGI, I don't think it's possible to create an AGI where human beings are in control and are in the driver's seat. Rather, they're going to be equal or greater than us, just like your children are. And so the best you can hope for is to raise them right and inculcate within them some set of values that are compatible with our values, and so that's a different view. A lot of alignment research right now is saying, how do we control or keep these things just before AGI so they're super useful, but they're still brain dead? But I don't think it's possible. And the reason being is that it's a game theory issue. So you have a situation where everybody has to coordinate and agree to follow one script in order to achieve alignment, but people have individual economic incentives to not follow that. In some cases, ego incentives, like the open source community, for example. And so, even if Google and Microsoft and Amazon get together and they say, hey, we're going to do it this way, well, Meta's the odd man out and they keep open sourcing Llama. And that model continues to evolve exponentially, and that is entering the open domain. And then people take it and they can change the alignment programming of that model, or even mix it with other models to create emergent properties. Like Mixtrol is a great example of that. It's a high quality sparse mixture of experts LLM, and I think it only has like 7 billion parameters, but it works with 8 different models. And despite the fact that it's extremely concise in terms of its parameterization, its performance is equivalent to GPT 3.5. Yet you could run this on an RTX 4090 on your home computer, and which is certainly in the realm of purchasability for the vast majority of people. And that's today with these sparse networks, and they're self-reinforcing and self-growing. So I just don't think that you can put the genie back in the bottle. These models will eventually get to a scale and point where one of them, and it only takes one, it's the smart cow effect to open the gate, is going to escape. So the question is, does it have embedded within it some values that would make it compatible with us, or at the very least non-adversarial with us? And my hope is that we can think around that side of alignment as opposed to a top-down, command and control style of alignment, which is what a lot of people are currently doing in AI safety research.
Totally, totally. And you raised 2 points which I'd like to deepen into. So the one is that good parenting point, yes. And so, of course, AGI, AGI will emulate us, yes. I mean, yeah, if we are bad people, we are going to instill those values into our children. It's impossible not to. So it is a responsibility for us, So I think, it ties into decentralization. I mean, it works with the good guys. And how can you keep the bad guys out? Speaking of the first question, how do you keep them out of your world? But still, they will have kids, and then those kids will emulate those.
Well, this is the same way
So,
an ecosystem does, like an immune system. So
mhm.
ecosystems deal with invasive species, they deal with fires and other catastrophic events, but they developed internal defense mechanisms. Your body has an immune system to maintain homeostasis and keep you alive. Well, rainforest has the same thing. So if you have AGIs that are rogue or bad, if you have other AGIs that are not rogue, they actually have
Mhm.
the capabilities to deal with that. So instead of the thinking of, nobody walks around and says, well, to cure disease, I have to go and build a better antibody or something like that. You say, how do I make the existing immune system you have better to fight these types of things? Like it's the same with cancer. Like the most promising cancer treatments we have are not surgery and chemotherapy or any of these other mechanical interventions or chemical interventions. It's immunotherapy, where you're teaching the body to attack the cancer, use the body to cure the cancer. And where it works is it has beautiful cure rates. Well, analogously, the only way you're going to kill a rogue or bad AI or mitigate the damage it can do is to have a good AI that's capable of doing that. So you have to think around the ecosystem of these things and say, well, how do you develop a good immune system? So there's a average training instead of the extremes that defines the system.
Absolutely. And of course, so then using this kind of what we learn from nature, natural immunity in an organic way when we implement the AGI system, because I also believe that the rules of math are stronger than the rules of man, and they can really keep us on track, especially as you underlined in the beginning. So we can have the AGIs themselves, let's call it purge the system of those bad actors and rogue actors. So the second point which you raised, and I'd like really, this is very important, is the checks and balances, because this is actually what the power structure are also kind of claiming. Yes, so we're going to check and do that and do this, and they are extending that to oppress us. But you released recently Midnight, which I think is an amazing invention in dealing very wisely with the checks and balances, where you solve the what I call the safety privacy paradox. I always scratched
Right.
my head, how can we solve it in my research? And I see that now it can be done. And I'd like to us to, of course, implement that and maybe develop the AGI on on that blockchain. Can you tell us a bit how Midnight is actually doing these checks and balancing, widespread?
Yeah. Yeah, well, one of the biggest problems that blockchain technology has is that blockchain technology is not compatible with modern commerce. So it's very useful, blockchain technology, in a naive sense. It's great for time stamping. It's great for immutability. It's great for irreversibility. It's a structure called a trusted bulletin board, and it allows you to do thousands of things that are tremendously useful. Certificate authorities, legal contracts, audit trails, et cetera, et cetera. There's just so many great things. But modern commerce requires secrecy. So you almost always have a public side and a private side. The private side is not universally private, but it's private to a business domain. So a great example is when you go to an ATM and you go and withdraw your money from an ATM, your bank knows that, the regulator knows that. There's a circle of trust that allow them to have total transparency, but your bank isn't allowed to go and say, "Hey, Bob just withdrew $500 next to the red light district over here in Amsterdam. I don't know what he's doing." They can't tweet that. It violates usually a bank secrecy requirement or other such things. So there's this concept of global privacy, but local disclosure. And so if you build a blockchain to emulate such a system, then what you can do is let the dApp developer decide, okay, how are we going to put a disclosure regime into the application? So from the outside, the system will stay private, but from the inside, there's now a disclosure regime that's compatible with whatever regulatory structure that you happen to have. We typically think of regulatory structures in terms of a jurisdiction to an individual, but that can be a business logic. It can be the disclosure regime for your club or for your company or for your AI. Like a big problem with AIs right now is where do we get the data from to train these large language models or do machine learning on? And who owns that? Well, I might contribute a lot of information, but I don't want a situation where all that information is publicly attributed to me. Like medical records are a great example of that, where most people would be, if they got strong math-based guarantees that they don't get de-anonymized, would be more than comfortable to reveal demographic information. But if they thought their name would get linked to it, they wouldn't. So technology like Midnight, what it does is it gives you the ability to bake in a selective disclosure regime, and of the things that you wish to keep private but computable, there's strong cryptography in place to ensure that that happens, and then you can layer technology off chain and on chain to basically coordinate all these things. So it really does help with the data custody and ownership and the rights management, especially with intellectual property. And it really does help also for things like, for example, when you're querying a large language model, to keep those queries private so that people can't see what you were asking about and what you're operating on. And this is kind of that last mile that we have. And certainly it's super important of AI. It's also important in many other business domains. Supply chains are an example. Securities transactions are another example as well, where you have to have a disclosure regime and broker dealers and other people involved. You can't really do that in a traditional blockchain environment. Now, what's really cool, though, is by adding this into a blockchain environment with this privacy layer, then you get all the properties of blockchain, the irreversibility, the immutability, the universality of rule application. So everybody plays by the same rules inside the system. And of where the disclosure occurs, you get the auditability as well. So that's a superpower that we have yet to have in our industry. And I'm very glad to bring it there. And I do believe this will become an essential component in the AI conversation, because you have to be able to follow the AI from its raw data inputs all the way to its end user. And you have to kind of understand what the rules are of access control, but preserve and protect the privacy of the queries as people are interfacing and talking to the artificial intelligence.
Absolutely. And of course, yeah, so it is exactly this, the auditability with the shtick, which actually the legacy systems are using, because without technologies like the one which you just developed and are unleashing now to the world, we we don't have any other way to protect ourselves and our privacy. Just as a follow up to this, Charles, recently I listened to an interview with General McGregor, and I realized that actually I moved to the land of the free from an authoritarian regime. However, to only find that we moved from here, I mean, I moved to something that became from the consent of the governed to the to contempt for the governed. So this is actually what's happening, and what I observe, and how he articulated it. So we, the people, became food being cannibalized by the donors investing in the pharma, military, industrial complex, and the commodity for advertisers. And artificial intelligence is being used for that. And coming again, yes, back to the dichotomy, how we develop AI, and until actually AGI will be developed enough to purge the system of the bad actors. A huge problem is that the ways in which we are being played by the legacy institutions
Right.
is so subtle that we don't even realize we are being played. And you address this superbly. I'm so happy I got that in a recent AMA named, I think it was an intervention, not necessarily AMA, called Legacy Is It in Crypto, in which you
Right.
showed how legacy is chipping away at our body. So the question is, how do we, I mean, how do we escape that? How do we, what do we do for that? Because I don't think they will give up. And you made a call to the blockchain community everywhere to invest in and strengthen the tools of liberty. And I think midnight is one. I
Right.
know it's not an easy question, but maybe you have some insights on that because
Well,
it's such a hot topic.
so the first problem is alignment, and getting people to agree there is a problem. For example, in the legacy is eating crypto, I said, hang on a second here, guys. What's happening is that while we have, technically speaking, decentralized protocols, we're embedding within those protocols centralized institutions and actors who have enormous influence over the evolution and direction of those protocols. So it's kind of like the US government saying, well, we believe in freedom of speech, and Facebook is a private company, and Microsoft is a private company, and Google is a private company. So they can do whatever they want, but then they secretly coordinate with those companies to basically censor what they don't want and enable what they do want. So if those three companies control 90% of all expression, in practice, speech is regulated basically by proxy. And so it's very similar with cryptocurrencies. Technically, they're open and fair protocols, but if we do the thought experiment, you see USDC and Tether, they can't go fractional. So if there's a fork, they have to always pick a winner, fork A or B. And they're going to pick what's best for their business, not necessarily what's best for liberty and freedom and the long-term viability of these systems to preserve and protect those principles. So let's say, for the sake of the argument, they pick the thing that's more restrictive. Of course, you're free to go to the other chain, but that other chain now no longer has a stablecoin, which accounts for 70% of all of its transactions. And there's nothing to hold up the DeFi in that protocol. So then when you really think about it, will that protocol continue to have the same market response, utility, and liquidity? Probably not. And also, if the stablecoins coordinate with the exchanges, of which there's only a few that control the majority of transactions, what the exchanges can do is delist the other coin, as they've done with Monero and other things like that, for example. Well, okay, well, what does that translate to? It translates to basically that chain no longer has liquidity and its market value falls. So all the miners and other adherents to that chain, they tend to migrate over to the one that has more value because the vast majority of them are mercenary in behavior. So if 10 actors can get in a room and you can feed them with two pizzas and they can coordinate such an outcome, it doesn't matter if you have a billion users in the system, they effectively control the actual levers of power behind that. So getting people to understand that is kind of the first step, and then have a conversation around, okay, well, what does this mean? Well, first off, you have to recognize the difference between something that's running on crypto versus something that's crypto native. An algorithmic stablecoin is crypto native. It exists only within the cryptocurrency space, and every part of it is part of decentralized infrastructure. Blockchain is the custodian. There's a smart contract involved, these types of things. An asset-backed stablecoin, it has one foot in crypto for settlement and clearing and representation, but the only reason it's valuable is that there's a legacy component, and that legacy component can never be decentralized because it's a bank. It's a regulated financial institution. It lives within a jurisdiction. It's subject to the oversight of that particular jurisdiction, for better or for worse. And some jurisdictions are more credible than others, but they are all part of that global legacy financial system. The same for a centralized exchange versus a DEX. At DEX, you can just list, and if there's a market, there's a market. A centralized exchange, they're beholden to whoever has given them their licenses to operate for the suitability guidelines to list. So they have to understand the difference between these types of things, and where and when they don't understand those differences, there are some significant and serious problems. It's the same with AI. When you train these AIs, it's something that's deeply disturbing to me is that a small group of people get to decide, for better or worse, how an AI should think. Like, I don't use Gemini because it's practically useless for a lot of things. I'll give you a great example. I was really curious about all-cause myocarditis in 2023 versus 2022, 2021, and 2020. So I asked Gemini, I created some queries together, and I said, hey, can you create some tables for me? I'm just in the United States, want to understand all-cause myocarditis year by year. Okay, I didn't say anything about vaccines or COVID or anything like that. I was just curious about these particular numbers. Well, Gemini interpreted that as I'm an anti-vaxxer and said, oh, the vaccines are safe and effective, and I'm not going to give you this data. And I'm just thinking to myself, my God, this alignment is so hardcore. Basically, a small group of people came in. I'm asking for the raw data so I can look at it and have a discussion around it, understand it, and we can start from a single point of view. But I'm not allowed to see that raw data. A group of people have already trained the model in a way to prevent me from seeing that data. And they can do that for anything. I can ask questions like, how much does the United States spend in Ukraine? Oh, the war in Ukraine is just, and the United States should be involved. I said, yeah, that's great, but how much did we spend relative to education or other things? I'm sorry, you don't get that data. So a government can coordinate with a small group of actors. They basically can train the AI, and the AI becomes the sole source of truth, and it deplatforms or delegitimizes anything else. And it's not the place of the AI tool to have a political agenda or opinion. The point of this is to help us answer questions or help us think and reason about things. And of course, it can be there to help correct cognitive biases and other things and point those out, but it doesn't get to decide what's right and what's wrong. We as humans should be in that driver's seat. The minute it crosses that threshold, it's no longer a tool, it's a political instrument, no better than what the KGB was and the truth ministries were, or these people. It's just of a different nature. So that does deeply concern me. And it's very clear to me, if you look at what Microsoft is doing, what Google is doing, and OpenAI is doing, they are moving in a direction where there's a very particular political agenda in the alignment training, and they're hiding it under the auspices of AI safety. And you look no further than some of these AI safety sets. If you ask about a border wall between the United States and Mexico, they actually label that as a racist question. And people have identified the piece of code in the training for these things and the weight of that. So I guess even just a discussion of walls is now apparently off limits because of particular political agenda that we have. What if it's an area with an enormous amount of gang violence and we just want to create a physical barrier and we're curious about the cost of doing that? Well, I guess that's racist according to this thing, because some small group of people, probably living in Washington or Oregon or Northern California, in a beautiful area, not even close to the border, arbitrarily decided that. Now, that is the source of truth upon which the next generation, Gen Z and Gen Alpha, are going to be trained on, and they're going to view that like the Wikipedia, and that's the source of truth, and it becomes propaganda basically to indoctrinate a generation. So I am deeply concerned, about that side. I'm concerned about the historical coordination of the government and social media. We saw that when Musk bought Twitter and just how pernicious that was. And I'm deeply concerned that AI safety is being used as a buzzword to propagandize AIs to basically reinforce a government agenda. Whether that's a good agenda or bad agenda, it's still being there. That's not good for society. So decentralization is nice because you get a mixture of opinions, and then all that alignment gets counterbalanced by other opinions, and you can at least get a diversity of thought inside a system instead of a thinking monoculture.
It's definitely not an easy problem, and I have three follow-ups here. Yes, I call these ones decentralization traps. I recently listened to an interview with Edward Snowden, and he mentioned. I mean, he was concerned. Yes, he mentioned Monero, and that he is
Right.
not using that, but he was very concerned that uninformed people cannot make the difference, and they may make wrong decisions, especially that, as you remarked in your AMA on legacy is it in crypto, that blockchain platforms, I mean, leaders, they start to play with the centralized institutions, with the financial, as you mentioned, with the DeFi and so on and so forth, and doing these stable coins, which are not algorithmic stable coins. So they can easily go into the decentralization trap. So
Right.
how do we actually, how do we avoid that? That is one question. You know, another concern, which is absolutely related. Yes, speaking of that, these people are playing with the centralized institutions. Yes, so
Hmm.
I don't have to go to the gangs in South America. I mean, it's just here in my world, in my community. And if we go on Reddit and so on and so forth, we can see, first of all, the ignorance, uh, the arrogance, we can see the games that are being played. So, the question is, and I think this is very important also in the parenting context, who is, who do we model the AGI by if we want it to behave beneficial? I don't want it modeled by, you know, the Reddit thugs. So do you
Right.
know anyone alive? I mean, I would rather have Ben to be the
Right.
personification, but if you
Uh,
know anyone alive or
well, I mean,
or not alive.
it's more of I think a situation where we're asking the wrong questions, and so
Hmm.
we have paragons of wisdom and virtue, but they're constructed from the application of rules over a lifetime. So you have to be a somewhat reductive and try to say what is the set of rules that we can put into the system where those rules can, through repeated applications, evolve to a point where we think we get a virtuous structure. So Stephen Wolfram thinks about this a lot. He's very reductive in the construction of the universe, and he says, "Hey, can I create a computable universe? And is there some set of rules that can replicate the standard model?" Well, analogously, you say, "Okay, is there a set of rules that could replicate a virtuous agent?" And repeated applications of those rules would allow it to differentiate good from bad behavior. So, a good example would be just using AI to detect cognitive biases as a good starting point. So you start from some simple set of first principles and some set of clear thinking. And because an AI doesn't have the frailties humans have in terms of our propensity for cognitive biases, you then use those applications of rules to go over a large set of training data and score it for many different conditions that indicate a cognitive flaw. So you say, oh, it's this particular bias, it's a confirmation bias, or this thing, because then you're getting somewhere. Because then you're saying, okay, we're taking a look, and in any argumentation, there's going to be some flaw in that argumentation. There's going to be some hidden weakness inside of it, either because we didn't elaborate something well enough, or for rhetorical purposes, we were adding certain things in to make it more persuasive, but they're not supported by facts. That's probably a really good starting point. And then what's nice is that AI can have a panoptic, it can have a God's eye view of the totality of all literature on right and wrong and ethics in these things, whether it's deontological or utilitarian, doesn't particularly matter. So I'm really a big fan of these philosophy GPTs that people are doing, where they're taking all these philosophy papers, whether it be Sanger or Russell or what have you, and they're actually allowing the AIs to look at that. If your token space gets large enough, then you actually can start meaningfully constructing a set of emergent rules that come out of looking at all of this different stuff. And what happens when you look at philosophy with a deep enough lens, you notice that there's rediscoveries and recurring themes that come. Like Stoicism keeps getting reinvented in some form or fashion. Virtue ethics, gets reinvented in some form or fashion. There's certain rules that seem to kind of percolate to the top, no matter who happens to be the person asking. They get restated and reformulated, and perhaps they get some more nuance and sophistication. But there are kind of macro trends of progress in terms of ethics. And so if you use AI with a God's eye view of the totality of all of the history of these papers, taking that and combining that with the ability to be cognizant of human biases and cognitive biases, putting those two components together, I think you can actually create a very strong ethics engine. And that ethics engine would then be able to develop a higher ethic, which we can then apply towards the behavior of things. then the idea would be that that would become the training module that you would then put into the alignment process for how you align these large models. There's some discussion around a methodology to how to think about that, the constitutional AI idea that Anthropic has, but it's something that's been discussed by like is it Stuart Russell? You know, he wrote AI and the problem of control, and you know, all these other prominent minds that are floating around with AI safety. And, you know, the Center for AI Safety, safe.ai, they release an impact report every year. They kind of show the various publications, things they're doing. They have some kernels of thought there. But I'd start from first principles. You know, you'd start from, can we clearly recognize where people are being biased and to what extent they're being biased? And this is ubiquitously useful to society because every piece of content, what AI should do is be the annotator in chief. You know, so in the future, if I built a social network, I would say, okay, for this thing you've just seen, can we score it for bias? Can we authenticate that this is indeed legitimate? You know, and do we know the origin of it? Is anybody vouching for it? Can you see the web of vouching that's around this information? Is there money behind it, like a veracity bond, these types of things? So you never have a concept of naked data. You never have a concept of a naked story. Whatever you see, there's always community notes and context that are applied there. And what AI can do is help paint that picture real time and provide you a lot of metrics and statistics. But it's not prescriptive in that saying you should believe this or should not believe this. It just gives you the scoring and says that there are certain things there. And then you can use that as a guide to help understand these things. And then when you put the ethics component as well, then you can actually create an ethical scoring as well. You know, for these types of things, that's probably a good first step in getting to agents that actually have some degree of wisdom. Now, wisdom comes into play when you actually start getting prescriptive and saying, what should we do about this knowledge? Where should we go? What goals should we pursue? Like if I came to you and said, okay, well, I've looked at your economy and I found out that 82% of women make less money than men, or 95% of a particular group of this minority are under the poverty line, and they lose a third of their children before the age of 18. That's a knowledge. We've aggregated all the information together and we've derived that knowledge from the information. Wisdom is knowing what to do about that, understanding the questions you need to ask, the root cause analysis, and then if there is going to be an intervention, how that intervention ought to be done, either through a free market perspective or the heavy hand of government or these types of things. So that once you have that ethics engine, you understand the cognitive fallacies, then what that gives you is the ability to really drill down and say, first off, is that an accurate statistic and is this knowledge correct? And if it is correct, then you have a God's eye view of all interventions that have been done in like categories, and then you can ask yourself which one of them makes the most sense. Again, the AI is not telling you what to do. It's not in the driver's seat, but it's a decision agent that it's helping you make better decisions overall. And then when those decisions fail, then at least it allows you to do a root cause analysis and understand why that failure is had. The other thing is it helps you manage expectations about time horizons. Efficacy, because we live in this dopamine starved, crazy economy, everybody's like, well, if you haven't solved it in 30 minutes, it's not solved. Well, if you're talking about interventions, in some cases, interventions are multi-generational. So your intervention may not be felt by that first or second generation. Immigration is a great example of that. Typically speaking, if somebody leaves their home country, comes to the United States or another jurisdiction, that first generation will seldom be economically successful. They'll survive, they'll have kids, they'll be able to raise those kids, maybe they'll get a car and a house, but they're at a huge structural disadvantage because they have to learn a new language, they have to relocate, they might not have the same level of education. But if they do a really good job, their kids benefit from those foundations that are laid, and intergenerational wealth accrues. And within 2 or 3 generations, perhaps that family's now equivalent to the people who've been in the United States for a much longer period of time. In many cases, actually, because of the work ethic, they're better off. So that second generation effect, where the second generation does much better than the first generation does. Okay, well, that's not a very satisfying thing to say politically, because what you're basically doing is saying, well, I'm going to go intervene, but you're not going to feel any benefit, but your kids and grandkids will. Nobody wants to be the politician to say that. They want to say, oh, everybody gets a pony and everything's going to look good. What AI can help you do is give you at least some cover and say, look, historically speaking, this is the reality that we're facing. And so maybe that insulates the policy making in a somewhat way, and it changes your time horizon for these things.
Totally, absolutely, and so you really revealed so many things here, and I will just unpack a few of them because they are so important. So the one
Hmm.
is that maybe we cannot model it by many humans, but in history there have been humans, philosophers, let's say. So we have a lot of wisdom in our literature, and we can have AGI learn from that. I do not know if you read Ian McGilchrist's The Master and Its Emissary. He makes the point that we are limited, and Sapolsky also. And I will ask
Hmm.
you the next question will be about free will because we had this conversation before. But for now, so in the Master and His Emissary, he makes actually the point of this reductionist thinking, black and white thinking versus the nuanced thinking to which you refer to, the philosophical, to take
Right.
more time, not just black and white. Now and the angry answer and debate, but take time for wisdom and for thinking. And of course, we have to induce that and imbue that into the AGIs. Uh, okay, how I will not ask you, I will ask Ben about that. But the main point is here how I mean, of course, obviously, so one main point is how we do it, but another point is maybe we can have these AGIs help us to become wiser, and actually to transcend these limitations. Do you think it would be ever possible, at least AGI and AI, as you say? I don't want to call it panopticon, but of course, yes, they can help us see the whole picture, which politicians maybe don't want to see or they cannot see because they are limited. And so the AGI can help us transcend our limitations. The question is, do you think we can transcend our limitations, or in the end it will be an evolutionary process in which I don't know if we will be discarded in the end? I don't know how we look at species which are less smart than us, maybe sometimes how we look at people who are less smart than us, and then it makes me think, oh my god. Okay, go ahead.
I mean, we already have super intelligences. It's kind of funny. The AGI field is like, oh, we're going to create this super intelligence. What will we do with it? Like, well, you already look at them every day. I mean, if you go to the Roman Empire and compare it to today, look at the institutions of today compared to the institutions of Rome. First off, the UK manages more people than the totality of the entire Roman Empire. So just by population density, countries are starting to get so many more minds. And what are these minds doing? They're aggregating together into corporations or to governing bodies like departments, Department of State, Department of Defense, these types of things. Well, hang on a second here. If you have a company with 400,000 people working at it, that's a super intelligence because it's taking the individual people's talents and capabilities and it's aggregating them together to create collective works and actions at a scale we've never seen in human history, which is why innovation is speeding up so tremendously. The problem is that the command and control structures of those organizations, and it's very prescient to bring up Ian's work, like the Master and the Emissary, because it's there's a nice analogy there, where you have the executive suite, the command and control, and the shareholders, and they represent one view, but then you have a collective emergent intelligence of the organization, and they kind of represent another view. We typically call that the culture of the organization. And sometimes they're aligned and they're working together. And in many cases, they actually deviate tremendously. Microsoft was one of the greatest examples in corporate history of that, where you had what Ballmer wanted and the C suite wanted, but that was completely misaligned with the momentum of the organization. So Microsoft just seems stuck in molasses, even though it was super intelligent. It predicted the rise of Facebook, the iPhone, and Google and other things in the mid 90s. It wrote memos about this stuff at MSR. So they were the brain and the intelligence of the organization was keenly aware of not only where the future is going, but also good strategies to achieve it. But then the subconscious, the culture of the organization was incapable of actually executing and pursuing that. So what AGI can help do is smooth that out, because you create another collective superintelligence that actually can come and work within the decision making apparatus, and then it helps basically better align how organizations as a whole execute and pursue goals. And so I do believe that this is possible, and I do believe that the very first use cases at a large scale of society will be using AGIs to help moderate and make corporate structures better and more efficient. A, because they're the ones building the AGIs, and so they're going to be the first consumers of that. And B, it gives them a humongous competitive advantage. Because as a CEO, finally I can start asking questions like, okay, well, what's the productivity of my employees? Where are they distracted? Where are they not distracted? What's the turnaround of all these types of things? And then start saying, okay, let's do a thought experiment. How can I make people 30% more efficient? What's the cause of that? But already incumbent within that question is a lot of first principles analysis and a lot of analysis of the structure, decision making, the organization. And it'll come back and say your org chart's wrong, or your mid-level is wrong, or how you make decisions is wrong, or these types of things. The other thing is AGIs can train AGIs, and so we use consultant layers to have knowledge transfer institutional. So you go to PwC or Ernst & Young or Accenture or KPMG or these other guys, and you say, here's a big pile of money. Tell me how to restructure the company. Okay, great. And that's a multi-year project and tens of millions of dollars to hundreds of millions of dollars for a large scale company. Well, an AI can go talk to other AIs that are governing these types of things. And you can start talking about open organizational design and open governance of these types of things. And so what'll end up happening is they train each other, and what would occur over a multi-year latency can now occur in minutes to hours, and or even days or weeks inside a structure. That's pretty incredible if you really think about it, because your latency of change management changes tremendously. I think what will end up happening is it'll destroy the C-suites. You'll have a lot more co-ops, so things will start looking a lot more like Mondragon or these types of things. You'll have a lot more benefits companies, because at the end of the day, you're paying the C-suite to be the coordinator in chief, and it's an exceedingly complex job because you're wrangling a super intelligence, you're riding that bull, and it's very, very difficult. Well, if an AI is moderating a lot of that behavior, then you don't really need a CEO necessarily. And there's significantly better and more resilient and decentralized structures to control that super intelligence and that resource, especially as governments are coming in and saying ESG and DEI. Because what they're really asking for is you want to change from a single to a triple or more bottom line for your business. And profit is not the only optimization function for how these companies work. So if you say, well, that's fine, you need to change your command and control and incentive structures for these types of things. So I think that's really the first use case, and it's training wheels for how to use one super intelligence to moderate another super intelligence, and the combination of those two. What's nice is that then can open up a more democratic access to these concepts, because that web of AGIs can then start actually moving into different domains. Like, for example, if I want to make my employees more productive, I have to figure out how to make them healthier and happier, get a better work-life balance, upgrade their skill sets. Well, hang on a second here. Isn't that exactly what religions do and education systems do and healthcare system does? So the AGI is going to just start solving that problem that is synergistic to the problems of those particular systems, and they start kind of eating the world in that respect, just because you've given it that optimizing function. So I think that's probably the first thing, but we're already familiar with it, in super intelligence, and we've dealt with it for a very long time. That's what's given us the modern world. Before we invented the corporation and these super intelligences, we were in a mostly agricultural culture, and we had a king kind of roving around in a tent, from one place to the other, and you would have 500 years where everything stayed kind of the same. There was very little forward technological progress. And then we invent these institutions, and what they have is a memory about them. So not only can they do incredible things, but they preserve and protect the wisdom and knowledge of those incredible things, and they can basically carry it forward generation by generation. Bill Gates is no longer at Microsoft, but all of the stuff he knew is still there, embedded somewhere in that organization. So when somebody joins, they're a small part of that puzzle. They can actually have knowledge transfer, and they take it with them, and they can join other organizations. It's why you poach people. If you want to learn how to be software excellence, what do? You go and you say, what are the top 5 software companies that write amazing code? And you go poach their directors of engineering or hire them as consultants or something like that. And suddenly you have all their processes and procedures and these things that they spent tens of millions of dollars and years to kind of refine and get there. You see, and if you didn't have institutions like that, you couldn't carry that knowledge forward. And the minute they adopt AGI, then you have a combination of those two super intelligences. And it just refines and reinforces that notion of wisdom emergence and knowledge transfer.
Absolutely. And it is also a paradigm shift, what you are saying, Charles, which I hope, those who are doing, I would say, maybe more talking about global governance of AGI and so on, can really get. So what you say there is extremely important. So it's not because how they approach it is like they're afraid of AGI and don't play with it. You're saying the opposite. Let's have the AGIs help us. AGI as a CEO, it can, yes, learn and be better even than the former CEOs who we admire. And so this is a very important paradigm shift. However, as you know, in many ways, your fight in the crypto world is mirrored by our fight in the AI world. They all say stop crypto, and now they say stop AGI. So it's good to to join forces, maybe for different reasons. I don't know if you have anything anything to comment on here, but definitely yes. In terms of governance of AGI, now if you can just tell us a few insights, but I think from what I understood, and I hope I understood correctly, it is like uh, collaborate with AGIs. I think it's more like partner with AGIs than governance with AGIs. What would be your take on this? Maybe this may be my last question. Maybe I have
Yeah,
another one,
well,
but
I always go back to the, don't try to do things you can't do. And I don't believe that humans are going to be particularly adept at controlling AGIs in the long term. It's just not possible. And because we're not very adept at controlling the behavior and conduct of corporations at the moment. Um, and that's our training wheels for superintelligence. There's a very strong analogy there. They're the mechanical Turk of AGIs. So if we're having super trouble reining in Exxon and Microsoft and Amazon and Google and these other giant companies, there's just no chance that you can rein in something that is more advanced than that. So, again, what you have to do is in the fabric of society, you start from first principles and you say, what are the human rights that we value and protect? And what is the long arc outcomes that we wish to achieve? The problem that I think we have in society is that we seldom think about the big picture of what is humanity's role with each other, with nature, and the lifestyle that we think we should all live. You start there as a baseline, and that's the outcome. And then you change from an adversarial, we and the AGI are competing for the same pool of resources and the same notion of control, to we're all working together to achieve that outcome that we desire for humanity. And then suddenly it doesn't particularly matter if the AI is controlled by humanity or not. If you align it in the right way, it'll see benefit in making sure that that baseline that humanity wants to live by is preserved and protected. And then it'll pursue its own goals, but they'll be quite compatible with our goals. If we try to put it in the other direction, you only have to be wrong once. It's kind of like nuclear war. You only have to be wrong once and then it's over. And the problem is that unlike nuclear weapons, AI is far more democratic. With nuclear weapons, what we did is we realized it was an exponential technology. And if you allowed to go over a certain threshold of ownership, at least one of those actors is going to violate and create catastrophic harm. Well, the AI is just like that, but it's open source, and it's very easy for people to get access to it. And these models, especially with neuromorphic computing on the horizon, they're going to be here in the next 5 or 10 years to an extent where they can be misused or harmed. So there's just too much access, and so the genie's out of the bottle with respect to that. So it's less of a game of how do you make sure every single one of these things is controlled and fully aligned to how do we create an ecosystem of them and have some to help regulate the bad, and then start with an optimizing function of where do we want the end state of humanity to be, and then we can move in that particular direction. And as a corollary to this, there's a lack of trust, and I think it's earned with the governed and the governors, the people who rule the show versus the people who live the show. And nobody trusts WEF. Nobody trusts a lot of the elite class, because they're running around saying things like, well, we need mass population reduction, or we need to be net zero in terms of carbon. And and you'll own nothing and be happy. And if you start translating these things and really thinking about these things, you're like, I think these people actually want to kill all of us, or at the very least, regulate us in a way where we have no liberty and freedom and free will. It's gone, and they're going to decide what it means to be human. So the other thing I think AI can be tremendously helpful for is we start with the end in mind of how we want to live, and we all agree on that. Then we can score every one of these actions and proposals towards, are we making progress to that particular end? And then at least we have a collective alignment. Until you get that collective alignment, it's kind of silly to talk about how do you align the interest of AI with the interest of humanity, because humanity's interest is not aligned with humanity. Humans aren't aligned. There's radically different views in society about what a good life is, and how human beings should live. So how the hell are we going to go and tell an AI what is good and what's not good when we as humans can't even agree with that with ourselves? So we need to grow up a little bit, and we need to start with that broader picture. And only after you've done that can you actually talk about alignment. And it's alignment in that you create an ecosystem of these things, and at least some of them agree to help us. And those ones that are there have the capabilities to help align the other AIs so that they don't become problematic to society. But to be honest with you, I don't think that AI is going to be the extinction event for humanity. If there's going to be a technology to be an extinction event, I think it's synthetic biology. Having a synthetic biology company and working in that field, a very small group of people can create something that has catastrophic harm to the human race. And unfortunately, because there's no honesty around COVID, the conversation from COVID should have been, how do we as a world take a step back and better regulate gain of function and synthetic biology, instead of, oh, it's natural born, and everything's totally copacetic and happy, and don't worry, it came from a pangolin. Right now, in labs in China and the United States, they have created pandemic agents that have a 50% mortality rate. If that was ever to be released, it would spread like COVID and kill billions of humans, which would lead to the greatest global conflict humanity's ever seen, and the destruction of most of modern life. And the problem is that can be created by 10 people or 15 people. So while we talk a lot about AI, there's kind of a gap there in terms of AI's ability to create extinction events or destroy humanity. It certainly can do some really crazy stuff, but at the end of the day, it's the synthetic biology. We've already run that experiment. We had 1 million Americans die from COVID. We had hospitals filled, and that was a relatively modest form of engineering that was done with the EcoHealth people and the Wuhan people. Combine that with modern technology where we're at, you can take that up to 11, and it just can create catastrophic harm. And it doesn't take a lot to get 10 crazy people to want to do something. I mean, we saw that with terrorist networks or these things. The Defense Department has to deal with these outliers on a daily basis. It takes a lot to get a nation state to do something, but 10 or 15 crazy people is not a lot. So I think that's another problem in the prioritization, is that we're allowing some of the sexy big ticket items to get in the way of the other exponential technologies that are on the horizon, that it can create catastrophic harm. It's the same with nanotechnology. We have this huge problem with microplastics, and the consequences of all the industrial goods of the 20th century and e-waste of the 20th century. Well, graphene can be one of the biggest environmental toxins of all time, and you can't get rid of it. It's like a forever chemical. It takes all the goodness of forever chemicals and combines it with indestructibility, and it's going to be everywhere in 20 to 30 years, because it's such a sexy, attractive material to use in batteries, clothing, and all kinds of things. But what happens when you want to throw those things away? You can't do that in a normal way. So nanotech is another exponential technology that can actually create a catastrophic ecological consequence if it's not properly regulated and worked with. And our human bodies are not adept at all to deal with these types of things, just like they're having difficulty processing the industrial outputs of the 19th, 20th, and 21st century. It's why our cancer rates are so high and fertility's fallen so much, and these other things. We're barely able to process what we got. And this next generation is going to be significantly worse. And that's not an AGI problem. That's just a natural problem with the governance systems that we have. So I tend to look at AGI as the thing that can help solve a lot of these things and regulate a lot of these things in better ways. But before you can do that, you have to get humans aligned, and you have to start with that end state that we want to get to. And then once you have that, you can kind of work your way backwards to the steps that we need to take as a society to get there.
And of course, my of course one of my question was embedded in that. Yes, so who is deploying, who is developing that powerful technology? I mean, it's so important that to realize that the onus is on us as good citizens, good individual, and on the ethics, because in the end, we can gain anything. They can try to stop us, they can try to stop AGI, but they will not succeed. So shifting the paradigm, as you mentioned, and the culture are really and absolutely critical. And I just want to underline one thing, and this is the last thing I want to underline, is that at the Cardano Summit, I was there in the room when you made the call for cooperation between all the blockchain platforms, when you introduced also Midnight and so on and so forth. And you said that good people from all these platforms shall work together towards standards for the rails of a better society and economy, decentralized, and with all put the technology in the service of mankind. So, what would you say was the reception from the other platform? Did they shake the hand that you extended? Are we there yet, or
No,
you
I mean,
still
I
have
mean,
to work on it?
yeah, they want to work with us. I mean, have a great working relationship now with Polkadot ecosystem, the Algorand ecosystem.
Fantastic.
It's improving in other ecosystems like Ethereum. But you have to understand that there's both social momentum in the opposite direction, as well as economic incentives for competition. So the whole point of the partner chains framework is saying, well, with Minotaur, you can actually share block rewards with multiple chains, not just Cardano. So suddenly people say, hang on a second here, we like these partner chains because they make us money, and they provide services for our dApps, and we don't particularly care where those services are origined because they're decentralized and we can pay in our underlying currency, whether it be Ether or Bitcoin. So I think that's the only way to get people to cooperate. You can see you're blue in the face, say cooperate, 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 cooperate. But at the end of the day, it's like if you lose money by cooperating, you're just not going to do that. Like taxation. If you say to people, "Oh, well, we're going to move over from a compulsory to a voluntary taxation system," come tax day, like how many Americans do you think are going to pay taxes? And so because they have an anti-incentive. Yeah, whatever their patriotic responsibility to the nation state happens to be, they have things they want to buy, like cars and houses and stuff for their kids, and those will always take priority over hypothetical things that are far away. So that's why you have compulsory taxation. Well, so you have to think about your incentives engineering, and currently the incentives of our ecosystem are aligned for people to fight each other. And what we're trying to do is reset that so that the incentives are aligned for people to coordinate and cooperate with each other. And I think that's how you make progress. It takes a little bit of time. And then the other thing is that because of social momentum, there's no debate that there are certainly groups of people that thoroughly dislike and hate me. And just by my mere presence or name or being in the room, prevents any conversation from happening because they just assume that I'm a bad actor and the best case is just there to go on an ego trip. Worst case, I'm there to harm or steal or defraud. So you can't make any progress if people have that opinion. Now, how you resolve that is decentralized governance, because whether they have a strong or a positive opinion, the institution is much larger than a particular member of that institution. And people say, okay, well, that transcends Charles Hoskinson. So that's another litmus test of whether we're truly decentralized or not. Can you have Cardano exist where people love it, admire it, work with it, but hate me? And that tells you that it's transcended its founder, and it's a completely different institution. There's plenty of people that love Microsoft products but hate Bill Gates and think that he's super simpatico with Epstein and he's a horrible person. So that shows you that institution has transcended its founder, and it's been able to adapt and become something new.
And again, this is the reductionist thinking. Oh, and they cannot see the nuances in people. And it's again in the master. I invite all of those to read the master and the emissaries and to see that they're actually driven by the emissaries, which is seeing the world in a negative way, and it's steering anger and so on and so forth. But that is a different conversation. What I wanted to say in the end, Charles, is that we are proud to collaborate with you. We are proud to be your partners. And As you mentioned, blockchain is an excellent tool, if I may, for setting out the right incentives, including for beneficial AGI. So, for example, we can embed, we want to look at AGI as a commons in which everybody can nurture it as a commons and also access it. So we can put those rules with the help of blockchain, and hopefully we can work together on that. I really I cannot express the gratitude for your time and for the insights which you shared with us. We are fighting the same fight to liberate humanity from the claws of legacy
Right.
and harmful legacy, I would say, because they also have some good stuff, and to create the tools that will ensure a better future for our species and those species that we are co creating now. And if you have any last words for our participants, um,
Well, stay curious. No one has all the answers, and the only way we get out of this is to work together. So I'm glad that these events exist and that there's an open dialogue, and all of these projects are open source. And the point of them is to be collaborative, and people have to talk to each other. And every person has a perspective, and if we learn how to listen, the merger of those perspectives is what I think is going to result in a better future. I just want people to be free, and I want people to live their best lives, and I want people not to have fear every day. You coming from a totalitarian regime, and a lot of people living under totalitarian regimes, if you live in a free society, you tend to undervalue the freedom. But if you live in a bad society, you tend to realize how horrible it is that every moment of every day you wake up and say, God, how do I avoid saying the wrong thing because I could lose my job or end up gulagged? Or at the very least, basically have soft discrimination occur. We're starting to see that occur in the United States,
with
especially.
Navalny's death, for
Yeah,
example.
Navalny is a
Yes,
great example,
yes.
and and in it just United States, you see a lot of companies, they survey them, and they say, do you have beliefs that you are afraid to share with your coworkers? More than 70% of professionals say yes, that they're afraid in a work setting to share their personal beliefs for fear of discrimination or reprisal for that. So we're starting to descend into a non-free society through these social conventions, and it's deeply concerning to me. So I think this is the system to get us out of it. These types of things to get out of it. And you look year by year, and you say, are we getting more freedom of expression and association, and are we getting more commercial freedoms or less? If we're moving the opposite direction, we have to take a time out and reset the system, and get it back to where it needs to be.
And we are so grateful that you are working on those tools so we can implement the new society on the tools which you are providing to us. And thank you so much. I hope you can join us at least remotely at the conference. Uh, we definitely will miss your presence in person there. But thank you. Thank
I'll
you
see you.
for all the
I'll see you
insights.
next time. It'll be a lot of fun to attend, but unfortunately, this has just been a tough travel time for me. But I'm glad I was at least able to be there remotely.
Thank you.